29eronline.com tests the Pivot Mach 429. Welcome to our test site, the Jonesboro Fault Trail, located in central North Carolina. This is where we thrash and trash high-end 29ers so you know the true story behind these bikes. Please refer to our website for the component level of our tested bikes. Pivot lists this big Mach 429 as their top-of-the-line 4-inch travel, full suspension race bike based on the big 29-inch wheels. It is pretty fast, but I'm not sure race bike would be the best description. First, let's look at Pivot's rear suspension, a 4-inch travel DW Link design. This bike is equipped with the Fox Float RP23 rear shock with Pro Pedal. Notice suspension action as I compress the frame. An interesting feature of this suspension is this little coupling link that allows the spring arm to match drivetrain length. It aligns with the crank, and if you notice the rear derailleur, you hardly see any chain length growth. The next feature is this carbon fiber link on top. It has nice sealed roller bearings in all of the pivot locations. These bearings allow for extremely smooth suspension function. Notice how the carbon link is just molded to the frame. Next, notice how heavily built this frame is. There is absolutely no flex in it. I want you to take a look at the brace they put in the front of the swing arm. It has an X-shaped member. Here's a close-up picture of it. The clearance between this brace and our tire is quite small. At the most, there might be 3/8 of an inch clearance here. The designers from California obviously have never ridden much in sticky North Carolina red clay. There's plenty of areas here for that clay to pack into and stop the rear wheel movement. The next item of interest is the bottom bracket height. The factory specifies 12.8 with the standard 100mm fork. With the optional 120mm fork, we were able to gain an additional ½ inch of clearance. As the suspension compresses, you lose ground clearance. Look at how little ground clearance you have, and this is with the longer 120mm fork. One disadvantage full suspension has compared to hardtails is lack of ground clearance. This occurs because the suspension can compress. Look at how easy it is to hit my crank arm on a small rock. There is only an 1.5 inch clearance between the bottom of the crank arm and the ground when the suspension is fully compressed. Proper shock setup calls for 25 to 30% sag. That will knock approximately an inch off of your bottom bracket height compared to the unloaded specification. While test riding this bike, I was surprised how much I ground my big ring and jammed my pedals compared to my 26-inch full suspension bike. Now I am pretty light, but we were on very aggressive terrain, but that's what this bike's built for, right? And if you are planning on riding extremely rough terrain, I would skip that standard 100mm front shock and go for that optional longer 120 millimeter front fork. I believe the benefits of the additional ground clearance would outweigh any negatives on the handling side. The longer shock only handles slightly slower than the standard shock. I watched videos on Pivot's website showing bikes blasting down the mountain. Compare that to tight, turny Eastern single track where you're trying to power your bike through turns, pedaling all the while. That's why I hate jamming my pedals into the ground, because it can put you down fast. I will say this bike rode amazingly well with the 120 millimeter fork. The next thing we want to look at is the rear shock. The Pivot comes equipped with the Fox Float RP23 rear shock. The rear shock has a huge impact on the performance of the rear suspension. The big enemy of full suspension bikes is known as biopacing or suspension bob. This bobbing is the result of the bike suspension robbing some of your pedaling energy to pogo the bike up and down instead of driving it forward. Pivot has closed the performance gap between hardtails and suspension bikes with their latest design. As part of this test, we were able to get our hands on two different versions of the rear shock, the Fox Float RP23. The one on the bike is the high volume model. It's a little bit bigger around, it holds a little bit more air, and the one I'm holding there is the standard version of the shock. I set both shocks to the same air pressure, 80 psi, and I set the Pro pedal to the same level, level 1. On the high volume shock, it's supposed to have a linear stroke. The larger air pressure gives it a smooth, equal stroke all the way through, where the normal volume, as it gets to the end of the stroke, it's supposed to load up a little bit. And what I noticed on the high volume shock was that it was substantially softer of a ride, but it had a tendency to bottom out compared to the standard volume shock. I personally liked the feel of the standard volume shock. It seemed to cushion the end of its travel, unlike the hard jarring stop of the high volume shock. I also found I had to set Pro pedal to level 2 on the high volume shock to eliminate the bob. First, let me explain Pro pedal a little bit. Pro pedal is not a lockout. Pro pedal hydraulically dampens the smaller pedal-induced inputs to your rear suspension. This prevents pedal bob while keeping the rear suspension totally active for bigger hits, such as going over rocks and roots. Pro pedal is controlled by the little blue knob on the bottom of the shock. You set it to the right to engage it, and you flip it to the left to set it to the minimum level. Pro pedal has 3 levels. By pulling the blue knob out, you can select 1, 2, or 3. As a test, I rode the Pivot off a drop-off. The results are illustrated in this photo. If you observe the travel indicating O-rings, you can see that the lower high volume shock traveled a complete stroke compared to the upper normal volume shock. Stay tuned to 29er online for part 2 of this test.